All right, so as was mentioned, my name is Taylor Donaldson, and I'm a student here at Drake. And on campus, I do a lot of advocacy and activism for victims of violence. So as part of my efforts, I've made this both a research paper as well as a call to action, both here on campus and throughout the community. This paper was originally written in a class I took last year entitled Human Trafficking. And for my case study, I picked specifically the Bosnian Civil War and the unrest in the Balkan states. So first we'll look at some background information about the Bosnian Civil War and the surrounding Balkan nations. So right here I have a couple maps so we know specifically where we're looking at in the world. And the war in Bosnia was a culmination from a number of causes, including political, ethnic, and religious causes and goals by the Serbs and Croats that resulted in the takeover of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the early to mid-1990s. And these are explained more in depth in my paper, but the military and economic power used by the Croats and Serbs in the area cut off the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina from gain and goods within their own country. And according to Mary Kaldor in her book, New and Old Wars, the military physically evicted people from their homes to provide more housing for the soldiers that were occupying the lands at the time. There were little use for men in the efforts here. They were primarily Muslim men and women in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the occupiers were primarily Christian. I'm looking at this specifically from a religious lens because I'm a religion major, but there were little use for these men in the war efforts, so they were typically executed or kicked out of their lands. And these executions typically took place in the middle of the street, right outside their homes, where the women and children were forced to watch, observe, and then, of course, taken to do as they wished by their occupiers. And these religious tensions were at bay, like I said, because the Bosnian population was primarily Muslim, and the surrounding countries of Croatia and Serbia were primarily Christian. Of course, there were mixed ethnicities and religions all interplaying here, but I looked specifically at the religious tensions as well. The oppressors thought that the two specific religions fundamentally believed in different gods. And this is an argument that's still at play here in religious studies scholarship. A lot of people like to argue one way or another, but fundamentally they did believe that their God was the right God or the true God. Thus, they had a religious duty to cleanse the area of Bosnia-Herzegovina of these sort of heathen Muslims, if you will. Olivera Simic, in a journal entry, said that it's been estimated that in 1993, approximately 20,000 Bosnian Muslim women were raped by Bosnian Serb women, or Serb men, excuse me, in what were known as rape camps. So essentially, when the lands were taken over, when these communities were occupied by soldiers from the surrounding nations, women and children were placed, deported or placed in what's referenced as rape camps, where the soldiers could essentially do whatever they want with them, including raping them, sexually assaulting them, physically assaulting them, and impregnating them to ultimately help the Christian population of the area. And if you know anything about Islam, then you may know that Muslim women's bodies are specifically sacred, and that if they are violated, women are seen as impure or no longer as virginal or, I don't know, no longer looked as great as if they are violated. So these impregnations and rapes by soldiers, by the occupiers in the nation, not only helped spur a growth in the Christian population, but also de-emphasized the Muslim men's interest in the women because the lineage of the religion is carried through the males. The women had no say in this over their rights of their bodies, over the religious upbringing of these children. Thus, the soldiers could sway them or raise them in any particular way they wished. Women were not only forced into these rape camps, but there were also women that were coerced from surrounding nations such as the Ukraine, the Maldives, to work in Bosnia at this time. And these victims were lured by job posts, gains, economic gains, and promises of a better life, only to find out that once they arrived in the area, they were often sent into prostitution, into the sex trade, to help pay back, in essence, the cost of their new owner for buying them, essentially. So here you can see that I've listed the UN human trafficking definition, and all of these instances, both in the rape camps, both in the lures from the surrounding nations to Bosnia, are classified as human trafficking violations according to the United Nations. And you can see here, this mentions many different kinds of trafficking, both labor as well as sexual trafficking, but I'm focusing specifically on sexual trafficking in the Balkans. And as matters in Bosnia escalated, the UN sent more officials to help conduct peacekeeping missions. As was mentioned earlier by Will, a lot of times the UN did have corrupted members, in essence. According to the Human Rights Watch, the International Police Task Force, or the IPTF, was made responsible for monitoring the local police as well as investigating perpetrators of human rights violations as well as human trafficking violations. Since these officials had full investigatory powers, they were immune from being tried in Bosnian courts, presumably to help protect their positions within their job with the UN. But some of these individuals took their privileges and helped facilitate and aid the human trafficking of women and children in the area. The Human Rights Watch also reports that some police officers accepted money or free sexual services from traffickers or bar or brothel owners in exchange for protection or being found out or prosecuted by the local authorities. Others gave bar and brothel owners tip-offs before conducting raids of the area and establishment. They engaged in document fraud to produce fake identification for the victims. And some police officers participated more directly in human trafficking efforts by being staff members or working within the bar and brothels, which essentially held the trafficking victims as in prisons. They were imprisoned essentially because they were typically only fed one meal a day, kept in very strict, small living conditions, forced to undergo sexual assault constantly, rape, other violations that I'm sure you can imagine. Trafficking victims thus were very reluctant to report crimes to these individuals, to these police investigators through the UN, because they were also seeing that these same investigators were becoming the customers at that same bar or brothel. They'd heard stories, they had seen them in person, so it was a moot point for them to come and take down their stories if they weren't truly going to help them. You could see that these officials weren't technically or weren't truly helping the best interests of the local people by also visiting these bars and brothels. The Bosnian government over time helped try to prosecute individuals of trafficking but the blame was constantly shifted between the police, the courts, the prosecutors, and most notably the victims themselves. Victims of violence throughout the end and after the end of the Bosnian Civil War were blamed for leaving the country too soon, so they couldn't testify in court against their perpetrators, but it only logically makes sense they would want to get out of that situation, return home, and hopefully find their families still there. Author Samantha Godek states, despite the eventual recognition by UN agencies that peacekeeping personnel were both complicit in facilitating trafficking and in using the services of trafficked victims, little action has been taken to address these crimes. Of course, the UN has put more regulations in place thus far to help curb these trafficking patterns, as well as corruption within the United Nations peacekeeping efforts. And as Will mentioned earlier, about 70%, I believe, of corruption does occur in these peacekeeping missions in these stations where the UN officials are supposed to be helping the local population from being taken advantage of. But it's yet to see whether these new regulations, these new advancements for the UN are truly helping the people. According to the Borgen Project, there are around 20 to 30 million slaves of human trafficking today. And maybe it is simply the activist in me, but I have included the National Human Trafficking Hotline here. It's crucial to understand how prevalent human trafficking is and has been within the world's military efforts and history as systematic tactics of war. The causes of war, such as economic circumstances, political atmosphere, religious tensions, must first be examined before we can fully grasp the background leading to conflicts of sexual violence and violation of women and children. It's also necessary for us to take a stand against these so-called heroes that the United Nations sends into countries to help protect the people, but ultimately aid and add to the problems within trafficking of women and children and sexual violence that permeates throughout the society. We must also notice that human trafficking, the larger issue, does not only take place away in foreign countries, in places that we don't know, we can't physically see, but it also takes place here in the United States and here in Des Moines specifically because we have the intersection of two major interstates here in Des Moines. There's a large amount of human trafficking violations that occur even here in Iowa. So as a plug here, or if you need any additional information about human trafficking within our region, within the United States, or on a global level, you can feel free to call the trafficking hotline. Or again, maybe it's just the advocate in me, but if you or anyone you know has been a victim of trafficking, please do call the human trafficking hotline. Thank you.